we'll make a start. So hopefully you've logged on to the right course. And this is about assessment in RE. Even though the picture is of my son holding a number 9, this doesn't mean that it's just to do with GCSE. In fact, there is little to do with GCSE, and I'll explain a little bit why later, but I think the same principles that we're talking about can be applied to GCSE as the stuff that I'm talking about with regards to early years foundation stage, Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, and Key Stage 3. Because of my role with one of the examination boards, I can't go into too much detail apart from the general principles of assessment with regards to GCSE and A-level. So apologies for that. Okay, so if I can just introduce myself. Those of you who have been on the CPDs with me last week, some of you are actually my students at the moment or have been students in the past, so you will know all of this already. But for those that are new, I'm Associate Professor of Religious Education at the University of Chester, and what that means is I get to talk about RE just about every day of my life. I spend time teaching mainly the RE PGC secondary on some master's courses to do with RE, and also to do with PGC primary and BA undergraduate to do with RE as well. So it's just essentially talking about RE and writing about RE for most of my life. If I can just mention that it's not just kind of ivory tower type things, that there are different things that I've done. So I was a teacher in secondary schools for 13 years. I was also an advisory teacher in AST for RE, providing support for primary and secondary schools. If you want to get in touch with me, my personal email is there. Most of you will have come through that route, which is contacting me through that. So you'll probably already have that. I'm not wonderful at email, but if you do contact me and I don't get back to you within a couple of days, then please feel free to chase me up. The last two things are my website and my Twitter handle. I tweet and write about all kinds of things. It's quite an eclectic website, so please feel free to have a look around on that as well. So my plan today is to explore the principles that underpin assessment with a couple of suggestions about how we can go about doing it and make sure that it is embedded in what we do. And so I just need to share a couple of things with you. I forgot, I'll just skip over those. When I first started teaching 22, 23 years ago, I went into a meeting with my head teacher, and this is what he told me, the top one. He said, RE teachers should stop moaning about assessment and just get on with it. I don't know what had caused that to be said to me. I was the only specialist in the school. I had been there as a student teacher, and they employed me, and we were talking about what we were going to do from this point forwards. And I think there was an issue with assessment at that point. We were moving from end of key stage levels to end of key stage statements to levels. And so he just said, look, just get on with it. And over the years, that has always resonated or just stuck in the back of my head. I can imagine him just telling me that, and that we just need to make sure that it is happening. However much we may disagree with certain aspects of it, it needs to be happening. And so that's the system within which we work. And assessment is therefore central to all the learning and teaching that takes place within schools. So you'll see here that there is a relationship between how we teach and assessment as a whole. So assessment has an unavoidable impact on the curriculum content and pedagogy experienced by pupils. So the way that we teach is unavoidably impacted by our beliefs about assessment, by the government's beliefs about assessment, and especially by our head teacher and senior leadership team's view on assessment. I have to admit, there are certain positions that I'm going to take today with regards to assessment that may be happening in your school, or certainly happen in schools around the country, that I don't necessarily agree with, and I think is just almost a knock-on effect of the system within which we work. So a few years ago, I wrote a book about teaching RE, and in it, what I suggested was the way that we teach Key Stage 2, And Key Stage 3 RE, the engaging activities and, for want of a better phrase, the fun activities needed to move up from Key Stage 3 to Key Stage 4. And I have mentioned this before, I think, but the idea is that if it's good teaching, then it will work. Yes, it will be at a deeper level. Yes, it will be in greater depth, but it should still work. But what's actually happened with the removal of levels and other kinds of things like that is the way that we teach Key Stage 5 Key Stage 4 has come down. And I think that's problematic. I really, really do. We are assessing children, we are teaching children in a way that is not designed for their age group and is perhaps not suitable for their age group. I recognize some people will disagree with me, but I think what's important is the discussion we're having today should begin to enable you to have that discussion within your own mind or within your own departments. And you may come away thinking, yep, I don't agree with anything that James has said, and that's fine. Unless you're one of my students, then you have to agree with everything that I say. But it's about just starting this discussion. And when I first started teaching, assessment seemed to be a peripheral thing. It was something, so I would design the unit of work or the year of work that we were going to do, and then I would think, okay, how am I going to assess it? It was a bolt-on. And Paul Black, even recently, although he's been writing for many, many years, has taught lots of different things. And this still continues to be relevant today. Many writers about assessment and many teachers regard assessment as a peripheral component of pedagogy, one that is inescapable, but which always threatens to undermine the most valued aims, that of developing the learning capacity of their students. The phrase assessment for learning challenges this view. So we will be exploring aspects of assessment for learning, because I think that's part of the pedagogy that we use. The way that we teach is there. It's weaved throughout rather than just something that we think about afterwards. And it's quite interesting because whenever I talk to students, and I teach on master's courses about this, so serving teachers, we slip into the language of talking about assessment to mean an exam or a test, rather than everything of which assessment actually is. And if we do that, I'm going to share an extreme example of what can happen. It is a satirized view, but no RE course is complete without the Simpsons, is it? So hopefully this will work.
Welcome to another school year. One important note, the flower-based names of the reading groups are now barnyard-based. Mr. Becker has protested the move, so his group will remain the Daffodils.
Yeah! Where my dills at?
Go Dills! Go Dills! Go Dills!
I never tire of that. One other announcement. At the end of the month, we'll be participating in the Vice President's Assessment Test.
He stinks!
We're assessing you, not him.
Withdrawn.
The VPAT is part of the federal government's No Child Left Alone Act. It'll be a rewarding day of pencil sharpening and eyes on your own paper keeping.
Cut the horse bull, Seymour. Your scores on this test will determine how much money this suck shack gets for years to come. So we will spend every moment of the next 2 weeks drilling the questions and answers into your soft little skulls.
Shaw is too gregarious, as he's full is too bellicose.
Okay, children, the answers to the standardized test fall into 12 basic patterns. Repeat after me. Akaka, dabica, akakaka.
Akaka, dabica, akakaka.
Number 2. Dakaka, a dada, batacat.
Dabica, a dada, batacat.
Biggest city in Montana.
Helena?
Wrong. 912 divided by 6.
You can't teach this way.
Yes, I can. Ha!
Oh.
But he's sure it works. Wah!
Where were these studies conducted?
Ball State.
So,
Okay, so that's kind of the idea. I think it may click on in a moment, but this is the, yes, it doesn't happen, but at the same time, elements of it does. And so if I use for example, When levels were removed a few years ago, schools were kind of left in limbo as to how we were to assess what we were supposed to be assessing against. And so the most straightforward was to perhaps take the GCSE criteria, this is in secondary schools, take the GCSE criteria and apply it down. The problem is that that has led to GCSE questions being a part of year 7, 8 and 9. And perhaps in primary schools, it's also led to the idea of perhaps the squeezing of RE. And this also happens in secondary schools as well, with the squeezing of RE as well in RE time, because English, maths and science has become the measure by which schools are judged. And this is to do, if Freire suggested that RE is emancipatory, not RE, education is emancipatory. So we can actually, it can be used to challenge the social system as a whole. And so he struggled with what he called the banking concept of education, which sometimes, if we overly focus on an assessed end product, can affect the way that we do things. So how do we find the balance that doesn't make assessment the be all and end all of everything, while still be an important part of what we do? And this is one of the things that we always kind of struggle with, is yes, schools are judged by assessment grades, whatever subjects those are in. So we have to fit into that system. But at the same time, do we need to do all the things that we do to check boxes and do everything else? I think assessment has a much greater role and a much broader role within the way that we teach. And what's interesting is we look at these two quotes from both Pollard and Stiggins. It's really disturbing, but I think we can visualize this if assessment is used badly. I'm not sure it always does this, but I think we can see this in the things and the way that we speak. So it does not just measure, or find out what a student has learned. It also affects what is learned, how pupils view themselves as learners, their attitude to school, and possibly their whole future. Because the use of grades, the use of numbers affects the way a student views themselves and their ability. And we always, well, I found myself as a parent, when a child comes home and says, I got such a thing, asking how it related to other people. And actually, that is irrelevant in the sense that how well did you try and did you understand the things that were being said? There's an assessment that my children undertook a couple of years ago. It wasn't in a school, it was outside of school. And because of their cultural capital, because of their experiences in life, they were able to do very well. And then there was another lad who also did this assessment, this test, and he didn't do very well, but that's because he didn't have the same experiences. And so it was an unfair test in that way. My children, yes, they passed, but at the same time, I'm not sure what that test actually showed about them, except for the fact that they felt smug that they got 100% in the things that they did. Smug's probably too large a word. So we have to think about the emotional impact of assessment when we teach, and why we're using it, I think, is most important. And also how often we use it. We will go on to discuss this, but if we're in a school that is requiring half-termly reports or assessment grades, yes, we have to do them, but is that doing what we really need it to do? And we will talk about all of those things in a few minutes as well. Just a reminder that if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to stick them in the group chat, or there is a way to put your hand up. I've not worked out how to do that, but there is a way to put your hand up as well. So the Teaching and Learning Research Programme summarised 3 main purposes for assessment. Okay, and so the first one is the use of assessment to help build pupils' understanding within day-to-day lessons. Fairly straightforward, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The use of assessment to provide information on pupils' achievements to those on the outside of the pupil-teacher relationship, so this might be parents, and to further in higher education and employers, different people there. And then, or it may be to secondary schools as well. And then the use of assessment data to hold individuals and institutions to account. Now, I think, and I think all of you would perhaps agree with me, is number one is the most important aspect of assessment. But I think when we talk about assessment, and when the media talk about assessment, and potentially when our school leaders talk about assessment, and this is a huge generalization, they may well focus on 2 and 3. Everything is designed because of the accountability measures. And number one is almost a knock-on or a silent partner in all of those things. And I think number one is the key thing within every aspect. And if we get number one right, then number 2 and 3 fall into place. Whereas I think the focus sometimes can be on number 2 and 3 to try to provide a stick or provide a motivation to get number 1 right. But I think the motivation should be to get number 1 right, and the other 2 things will take care of themselves. Okay, so please forgive me if I'm teaching you to suck eggs, but just a reminder, we have summative assessment, we have formative assessment within the general concepts of assessment. Now, I do think, if I'm honest, that just about everything that we do in school from early years foundation stage up should be formative. So whether we see it as a summative assessment, as in a end of unit test or whatever else, actually it should be used formatively. It should be used to inform future learning. And to be honest, I think there are only 2, and this is arguable, but I think there are only 2 definite summative pieces of assessment, and that's GCSE and A-level, because it does kind of stop there. But everything else that we do should be used formatively, but it isn't always. So I've seen tests that are used, marked, given a grade, whatever grade that might be, and then move forwards, but with no reference to what has just happened in the learning journey. And we will talk about that and how that can be the case throughout the next hour or so, as it may be. Okay, are there any questions so far? I know I've chatted on, it's been about 20 minutes. So are there any questions so far about anything that I've raised? I kind of tried to set the framework or the ground work before we kind of move on. Okay, so this slide is from Dylan William, and he suggests that a good teacher, if we're using assessment wisely, first of all establishes where the students are, identifies the learning destination, so where are we going, carefully plans the route, begins the learning journey, makes regular checks, and makes adjustments as conditions dictate. I don't think any of us would disagree with that within the RE curriculum. So we always, whenever we start teaching, need to know where pupils are, and we always need to know where we're going. But sometimes we have a learning journey that is mapped out, and it's the adjustments that are problematic. So what we do is we say, okay, we are here, children are here, and we want them to be here, and this is how we're going to do. So these are the things that they're going to learn on their journey. And I've seen some, I think, curriculum maps recently, and what it has is it has knowledge all the way along. And the idea is that every lesson you increase in knowledge and everything else, but there's not necessarily the checks on progress on the way. So we have this session, whether it's a half hour or whether it's an hour, whether it's every week or every 2 weeks, we have this session, we have to get through this detail, we have to get through this content, and then that will, you will, wherever you've got up to in that lesson or session, the next session you will start the new topic all over again, so that it's a fragmented journey rather than a flowing journey. And I think we need to look at that when we're looking at assessment and how we use assessment as part of that learning journey. So I think I shared this last week, but it's about each, although you have this overall learning journey, each lesson is reflected upon, and if the progress hasn't been made, and we'll talk about what progress means later, But if the progress hasn't been made, then it's taking a step back and actually not starting again, but beginning the process partway through, so that progress is always made. As opposed to, we've taught this, we'll assume knowledge, so we'll move on. It's about looking at, well, do they understand? Are they doing what I need them to do? Is it embedded? And if it is embedded, right, I can move on. And how do I move on in this way? And again, this isn't something that is earth-shattering, but I think it is something that we need to be aware of. So John Hattie talks about this a little bit in his cycle of learning. Trying to remember what it's called. Visible Learning, I think, is the book that this comes from. And this links very much with some writings from Dylan Wiliam as well. So what do I already know? What do good ones look like? And that's an important part of assessment, is providing exemplars and models for potentially children to utilize. What do I need to do? Co-construct success criteria. Now, this is interesting, and I think we will talk about this a little bit more. Every lesson that I think I go into over the course of a year, there are learning outcomes displayed at the front or the beginning of the lesson. People copy them into their books, or they'll be printed out and they're stuck into the front of the books. And then the success criteria are referred to potentially at the end of the lesson or never again, depending on what kind of lesson it is. And both John Hattie and Dylan Wiliam suggest that with pupils, we co-construct the success criteria. So we have a discussion with the pupils of whatever age and say, okay, this is the topic that we're learning about. And we'll look at this with a specific example of Ganesh later. But what do we want to learn? What are the things, and we obviously kind of manage that process and we know where we want to go, but also we respond to pupil need and kind of the ideas that they have and the questions that they have as well. And that's at the beginning of a topic, but it begins to co-construct what a good one will look like, or what success will look like in that particular topic. So then what learning strategies, and then creating the learning, and then reflecting on learning as well, which is self, peer, and teacher feedback. Now, Dylan Wiliam would suggest that peer feedback and peer assessment is easier than self. It's easier to be critical of someone else's work or to be objective about someone else's work than it is about self. So that's an important part of what we do. So I think we will talk about how we can perhaps show that at a future point. Okay, so again, any questions at all? I just seem to be rabbiting on with myself rather a lot before we look at what we are assessing in RE. Okay. So this what we are assessing cask builds out some work that is quite old, really, but has always been reinvigorated, that started off with West Hill. Many of you will remember the RE Learning Centre in Birmingham. And so this was part of the West Hill approach. But I think this is an important part of what we are assessing within RE. And I think potentially the second one is the issue that's raised most with regards to, well, how on earth can we assess this? So I think the first and potentially most important part of assessment in what we're assessing are concepts. Because I think, and if we look at this, when we teach, and those of you that attended the CPD last week about bridges in RE, sorry, I've just seen a question. Catherine asks, would you recommend Hattie 2019 Visible Insights to buy? I do think it's very good because it kind of gives some really detailed guidance on what feedback looks like and what we should be doing. I think it is quite good. I'm fortunate in the fact that I work in a university, so I don't always have to buy books, but it's certainly useful to read if you can get a copy of it. Okay, so last week I spoke about how the first bridge to learning is with pupils' own experiences, that if we can give children something to hang their hat on, as in within their own experience, then they're more likely to learn. And if that's the case, it's also possible to see that there is a development in terms of children's conceptual understanding, from concepts that they understand in their own experience, to then concepts that are common to all human experience, which is the green level, concepts that are common to many religions, and then concepts particular to specific religions. So we have these particular levels, if you like, that can be seen to be a conceptual progression. However, it can also provide a conceptual basis. So John Rudge suggests that concepts are the main focal point of any educational program. They're essentially ideas which help us and our pupils to make sense of our experiences of a great variety of things, objects, information, events, and occurrences. They help us to interpret these experiences. So they help us kind of move forwards with children's understanding. And so we have to be able to, if we're assessing where pupils already are, I would suggest that we want them to be somewhere within the top blue part of the pyramid, but actually they will be in one of the light blue, the green, or the yellow parts. And so we are beginning there to then enable them to make progress. And recognizing that means we are pitching the curriculum appropriately. And that's, I think, the most important part of assessment, is it's not about the tests that we do, it's about the way that progression is built in to the learning journey of pupils and the learning journey that we are designing for them as well. So that we begin with concepts. So let me use an example. This is from Jeff Teese. So this is within, oh, that's really horrendous of me. Teaching primary RE creatively. It's Sally Alton Chalcraft, I think. She's the editor of that book. So Jeff Teese suggests that there are specific concepts within each of the, and here he uses the 6 biggest religions. So within Buddhism, there's Anatta, Anicca, Buddha, Dharma, Dukkha, Karma, Metta, Nibbana, Sangha, and Tanha. So we can read those concepts, and those are concepts that we need, if we go back to the previous slide, excuse me, would be within the blue, the top blue aspect of concept of the pyramid of the concepts. So those are things that we want children to understand. And then on the right hand side, there are specific examples of how things can be linked. So with regards to learning about and from Sikhism and a visit to the Gurdwara, there are lots of themes or lots of concepts that are in the bottom 2. So with regards to children's own experiences and common to all human experiences. So there's hospitality, sharing, respect, gifts, learning, sharing, music, humility, holiness, generosity. So those are concepts that are within the children's own experiences or are common to all human experience. And then there are specific concepts that we would like them to develop. So having an understanding of concepts is really useful because it helps children build and learn. And so if we recognize that there is conceptual development going on, when we actually develop this, next time we come to the concept of remembering, for example, we could possibly start within the light blue section, because we will have already done it with regards to Christianity or with regards to Islam or with regards to Sikhism. So we can therefore begin relating it to other aspects of other religions as well. And so there are other examples there that Jeff provides from Islam, from Buddhism, and from Hinduism as well. And a lot of the concepts you can see are very similar when it comes to the shared concepts. But the specific concepts are what makes it distinct and what makes it different. And this is where the increase of learning actually takes place as well. So being able to assess concepts is really, really useful in the sense that in the sense that we use them as part of assessment. And assessment at this point is in the way that we design the learning that takes place. Okay, so Will has mentioned that for most children in a primary school, for example, they will start in the yellow, which is their own experiences. And that's really to be expected, because I think there are certain topics that we teach, even whether it's Key Stage 1 or Key Stage 3, where they just have never experienced any of those other things before. So we do have to start with their own experiences. And it does take a while to get further up the triangle, yes. And sometimes it's not a problem to take that time, and we maybe have to revisit it. And so we may just be relying on the yellow concepts. We might then teach it through and eventually try to get to the dark blue ones at the top. But actually, the things that the children are taking away, for the most part, will be in the yellow or within the light blue. And I think, to some extent, the idea of a pyramid may be problematic in the sense that there is no hierarchy particularly, it's just the way children learn. Now, there's also a question that's been raised about the concern of comparing religions. And I think, yes, that is a huge problem. I think one of the biggest untruths or fallacies or myths of RE is that all religions are the same. So I think when we compare religions, it's important not just to say, look, they're the same in this way. We also have to talk about how they're different as well. So I think when comparison is brought in, it helps build understanding because it gives us a starting point. But if all we ever do is say, well, this is like this, without recognizing the distinct differences that are in there, then I think it's really important. Then I think learning is problematic. But I think we always need to draw on those differences. So tomorrow I'm doing a session about Buddhism. And one of the dangers within Buddhism is the comparing or the identification of the Buddhist idea of life after death, rebirth, with the Hindu idea of life after death, reincarnation. They are, although they sound the same to some extent, they are very different. And so you use it as a starting point, but then show where the distinct differences are. Hopefully that answers your question, Danica. Okay, another book that's actually quite useful if you work in a primary school, but also if you work in a secondary school as well, because the ideas are really important. And this shows how that conceptual pyramid can work. So it's by Clive Erica, Judith Lowndes, and Elaine Bell-Chambers. And this is really interesting because they focus on the concept of change. And so there's 3 stages to this, and there's other aspects that surround it as well. But they begin by talking with children in the inquire phase about what change is. So it's starting with the concept of change, things that they will have experienced within their own lives. So for example, getting ready for PE by changing shorts into shorts and t-shirts. I always remember the first episode of The Vicar of Dibley where they sit discussing the change to women priests alongside traffic lights and cheese and onion crisps. So change is something that any child of any age or any person of any age can discuss at some kind of level. So then with the contextualizing stage, they look at potentially the stories of Zacchaeus, the tax collector, the story of the fishermen who became disciples, and the story of Jairus' daughter. It doesn't have to be all 3 of those. And they can, it says, become engaged in story through role play and through sequencing. So this is the context within Christianity. So they've had the concept of change. They've then contextualized it by using the stories. And then there's an evaluation. So what if Zacchaeus had stayed mean and greedy and not changed at all? What if the fishermen had said, no, we don't want to come with you and be fishers of men? What if Jairus' daughter had not got better and sat up? What if she stayed lying down? So it's beginning to ask questions. And then it says, and pupils were provided with a picture of a Christian in church, and a speech bubble said, these stories about Jesus changing people are important to Christians because. So this is how a concept is used to drive, but you can see how the development happens. So change within just general is fine, and then it's specifically applied to Christianity. And so having an understanding that concepts can help us assess and where children are starting from is really, really useful. Now, what I might then do, so for example, when I explore, for example, atonement or salvation within Christianity, is I may not start with the idea of change in their own lives, but start with the idea of change in Zacchaeus's life. So we're then kind of building because we've got that basis of knowledge and the things that can happen there. So there are some really good ways that we can use concepts to build understanding and to show that we have built understanding as well. Okay, attitudes. This is the second thing that form a part of our assessment strategy. And by assessment strategy, what I mean is the things that we are looking to build and help children make progress within. So these are taken from, I think, the non-statutory national framework, which is a good few years old now. But it's about, for example, developing a realistic and positive sense of their own religion or spiritual ideas, religion and worldviews, recognizing their uniqueness as human beings. So these are attitudes that we kind of develop, and there's open-mindedness, appreciation, and wonder. So one of the issues that we face if we're looking at attitudes and understanding and kind of those types of things is what we're using to develop those may be a bit of a blunt instrument and maybe shouldn't be assessed at all. So I'm going to show you now part of the West Wing. So there is a group of Chinese refugees who are claiming asylum because they are Christian. And so the leader has been brought. And so there is a question about whether they are faking their religiosity. So let's just watch a little bit of this. There are subtitles, I think.
There are questions as to the veracity of your claim to asylum.
Yes, sir.
How did you become a Christian?
I began attending a house church with my wife in Fujian. Eventually, I was baptized.
How do you practice?
We share Bibles. We don't have enough. We sing hymns. We hear sermons. We recite the Lord's Prayer. We are charitable.
Who's the head of your church?
The head of our parish is an 84-year-old man named Wen Ling. He's been beaten and imprisoned many times. The head of our church is Jesus Christ.
Can you name any of Jesus' apostles? If you can't, that's okay. I usually can't remember the names of my kids, or for that matter.
Peter, Andrew, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, Thaddeus, Simon, Judas, and James. Mr. President, Christianity is not demonstrated through a recitation of facts. You're seeking evidence of faith, a wholehearted acceptance of God's promise of a better world. For we hold that man is justified by faith alone, is what St. Paul said. Justified by faith alone. Faith is the true... I'm trying to... shibboleth. Faith is the true shibboleth.
Yes, it is. And you, sir, just said the magic word in more ways than one. Thank you.
Okay, so if we go back and it's about, we're not talking about someone showing their religiosity through RE, because I don't think that's the purpose of RE. The purpose is to develop knowledge, to develop understanding, but to develop attitudes as well. And so if we look at some of these attitudes that have been suggested with imagination and curiosity, the mystery of knowledge, the sense of wonder, being willing to learn and gain new understanding, that's really difficult to assess. in some way. And really what we can do as RE teachers is provide an environment or a learning journey where children are able to develop those attitudes, but is not one that we necessarily show or that we assess formally through a test or whatever else, because it's really difficult to identify those. And this is shown in the satirized view of the Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus took his disciples up the mountain and gathered them around. He taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God." And then he carries on through that paragraph. And Simon Peter said, "Wilt we be having a test on this?" And Philip said, "I don't have any paper." And Bartholomew said, "Does it matter about my spelling?" And Mark said, "Do we have to hand this in?" And John said, "The other disciples didn't have to learn this." And Matthew said, "Can I go to the toilet?" Then one of the Pharisees who was present asked to see Jesus' lesson plan and inquired of Jesus, sorry, I can't see, "Where are your learning and assessment objectives?" Another asked, "What range of teaching strategies do you draw from, and do you have differentiated provision?" A third Pharisee asked to see a cross-section of work, and Jesus wept. So sometimes some of the things that we see just can't be assessed. And we have to recognize that, and I think articulate that in the way that we, to use Ofsted phraseology, when we look at the intent of a subject in the implementation, then we have to be able to say, look, there are some things that we're teaching that are measurable, and we'll talk about those, but there are some things that are intangible. And I think we need to recognize this as a part of the expectations that we put into our lessons. And that's where assessment is far more than a test, and much more of just something that is woven into the way that we design our curriculum and the way that we teach as well. Okay, I've whiffled on for a bit. Any other questions up to this point? Okay, I'll move on to skills, because I think this, for the vast majority of us, certainly over my 20-odd years of teaching, skills have been the focus of the way that we assess. So again, the non-statutory national framework suggests these skills, so interpretation, analysis, explanation, learn to communicate their knowledge and understanding using special efforts. So there's lots of different things. When we look at the RE review that was 2013, and also Ofsted's Realizing the Potential, which was also 2013, these are some of the skills that are suggested by both of those documents that children should be developing. So inquiry, asking pertinent and challenging questions, gathering, interpreting, and analyzing information, drawing conclusions. So these formed the basis of what essentially used to be the level descriptors within RE. And I think I have some issues with level descriptors in the sense that they became a shorthand. So whenever we gave pieces of work back, perhaps we just said, okay, this is level 2, this is level 3, whatever else that might be, rather than actually becoming fully engaged with what each of those levels meant and being able to tell students what they meant as well. But they did provide a basis on which we could show progression. And so if we don't have a focus on RE specific skills, then Barbara Winterskill suggested, and she was HMI when she talked about this, that the most common contributor to low standards in RE is low expectations seen in written tasks which lack challenge. She then talks about other things as well. So extended writing takes second place to a regular diet of completing sentences, pointless drawing or illustration, and short comprehension answers to questions in a textbook or worksheet. And so if we understand the skills that we're trying to develop, then the work that we are setting, the way that we are pitching the content to the children that we teach, will be appropriate for their age group. And so with the removal of levels, we have been left with almost a vacuum. But most agreed syllabuses will have some guidance as to what we should do. So this was to do with a year 7 task, okay? So by using skills, we can improve the challenge within RE. So this was a real example. The topic is Muslim prayer. After an introduction to prayer by the teacher, the class are asked to design their own prayer map based on the initial discussion. To some extent, the skill being employed is to respond creatively. However, few aspects of any other skills are being employed. And through this task, a pupil may be able to articulate a very low-level skill of recognizing some different symbols. For the majority of pupils as a standalone task, this is not a stretching or skillful piece of RE, whatever skillful, well, full of skills. And so it's just design, color, draw, isn't this kind of pretty? And it's interesting. My daughter is currently in year 8, and she came home, no, she didn't come home. She got her home learning for the next 2 weeks, and one of which was RE. And there were 4 different tasks, and she could choose whichever one of those she wanted to do. It was just one of the 4. There was no guidance, just choose one of them. I looked at them and I recognized that they employed different skills and there was more challenge in some than the other. Although she's a bright girl, or maybe because she's a bright girl, she chose the one where she could just draw a picture. And so it's about making sure that the challenge is appropriate for the students that are there. So this says, I can't even speak. The suggestion is about responding creatively through a letter which explores the process of prayer, the meaning of the various actions, and why they think Muslims might pray. So the challenge is there. And so the end of key stage statements or the early learning goals are things that we can use to ensure that the lessons that we are teaching, the lessons that we have designed, are appropriate. And this is part of assessment. And I think this is potentially sometimes things that we miss. Assessment isn't about necessarily all the time, how are we going to measure? Rather, it's how are we going to pitch? And so on the screen in front of you are aspects of the early learning goals. So this is for the early years foundation stage. And so these are aspects of them that are specifically focused around storytelling. So I think that's an important part of all kind of RE from early years foundation stage all the way through. But if I'm pitching a story and I'm reading a story within RE, then I make sure that it's not just about reading the story. But I want them, for example, in the first one to anticipate key events, or further down talking about past and present events in their own lives. So again, drawing similarities and differences in relation to places, objects and things. And then being imaginative as well. So there's different things. So if I'm teaching a lesson with an early years foundation stage, then I want them to exhibit some of those skills. And by knowing those, I'm then able to pitch a lesson in RE appropriately. And that's the same with regards to end of key stage statements. So these are taken from the RE review in 2013, and most agreed syllabuses will have something similar. End of key stage statements. So one of the agreed syllabuses I've been looking at a lot recently is the Norfolk one. And they similarly have end of key stage statements and ways that pupils can make progress. And I think it's really important in assessment for us to have an understanding of these, because it's this that shows that work is pitched appropriately and that children are working at a level that is an appropriate level for their age. Now, this doesn't always happen. So for example, a key stage 1 skill is to retell some religious and moral stories. And so the example I always use whenever I talk about this is my eldest daughter's year 6 RE book that only had key stage 1 skills in it, because all she was ever asked to do was to retell a religious and moral story. Now, I think that's really important for a key stage 1, but if I'm still asking people to do that in year 5 and year 6 and year 7 and year 8, then there is problems there. So we have to pitch it in an appropriate place. And this helps us differentiate within the classroom as well. Because if a child, for example, fulfills that skill, then what I want them to do then is, for example, to understand links between stories and other aspects of the communities they're investigating. So what impact does that story have? For example, how is the nativity shown in the celebration of Christmas? Now, this is probably something that you're already doing, but it's important for you to look at the agreed syllabus. If you don't have an agreed syllabus and you work in an academy, then you can always use your locally agreed syllabus to support you with that. Or, for example, the RE review also provides that level of support as well, because it has these that are broken down, but enables us to pitch appropriately and make sure that we are assessing. So if we've assessed, well, yes, all children can retell a religious and moral story, we want them to be able to suggest meanings. But what ordinarily happens is, okay, you've been able to retell that religious story, that's wonderful, can you illustrate it? And I'm struggling to see where that may be. So there's three kind of levels of appropriateness with regards to the RE council. So on the first one, we've got know about and understand, express and communicate, and then gain and deploy skills. This was the move away from learning about and learning from, but these things are still there in the sense that we can apply all of those things. So then you think, well, what about, for example, GCSE? The grade descriptors at GCSE have almost disappeared, but each exam board has some key words. So for example, outline or explain or describe or give. And so we can use those as things that we can implement. Or for example, there are level descriptors as well in GCSE and within A level that we can actually highlight and we can actually use in differentiating and developing work. Now, I think what's really important is that there is a progression through all the different key stages that we can have a look at, well, what did key stage 1 expect, or what are the expectations in key stage 1, what are the expectations in key stage 2, what are the expectations in key stage 3. We shouldn't be merging them. Now, the benefit of the key stage 1 to key stage 3 descriptors are the sense that there is a flow to them and they do make sense, whereas the GCSEs almost kind of start all over again. So but what we shouldn't do is bring the key GCSE ones down to key stage 3. We need to be looking at the skills that are available there. Now, these are not the only ones. So for example, RE Today published these in about 2014. And there are a lot of agreed syllabus, because RE Today write a lot of agreed syllabuses around the country. And there's more detail within each of these. But essentially, there are 8 steps in relation to the 3 elements of the RE aim. So knowing about, expressing, communicating, gaining, and deploying skills. They're not dissimilar to the RE review things as well. But it helps us pitch lessons. So again, recall, name, and talk about materials, retell stories, describe religions, understand, explain the impact of. And so what we have then is we have some really challenging RE. And that's really key, because what we don't want throughout the year groups is the same. And I know you're probably thinking, well, why are you talking about all of these things and not about the strategies for assessment, like, I don't know, whiteboards and different things? Well, it's because if we get this right, then all the other things kind of can knock on from that. So the question has been asked, how do we deal with, for example, teaching skills if you find a key stage 2 class that doesn't have the key stage 1 skills? I think you have to go back to the start. And I think to some extent, yes. But you can then justify why you have done that. So if, for example, we're trying to teach children how to connect ideas with, let's go back to these, because these are the ones I'm most familiar with. So to retell some religious moral stories, and you're trying to link them to Christmas, for example, or a festival, but you're trying to link them to a festival and they can't tell the story, well, yes, we go back. And we kind of say, okay, well, let's take a step back and find a different way to retell that story. Maybe it's not a cartoon strip, maybe it's not drama, or maybe it is all of those things. So yes, I think it's important to make sure that children can do the other things before we move on to the next things. And I think you can, so if I went in to watch a lesson and I felt that it was pitched, for example, at Key Stage 1 and I was watching Key Stage 2, or it was pitched at Key Stage 2 and I was watching Key Stage 3, and you could articulate to me why you were doing that and all of those things, then I don't see that as a problem. Because you are beginning where the pupils are, and that's an important part of assessment, is not to start, and if we were doing maths, and that's obviously easier to perhaps see the benefit of starting earlier. If you're doing addition from 100 to 1,000 and you've not done addition, and the children can't get addition 1 to 10, then of course we kind of go back. Sarah suggests that the EP, the exceptional performance in the old level descriptors were what was expected at GCSE and not so much now. Yes, I think that's right. And one of the problems is the way that we assess, or the end of key stage statements, have come full circle. So when I first started, we had end of key stage statements, which we turned into levels, which we now have turned into end of key stage statements. And there wasn't something done for key stage 4. So we have to look at those types of things. Do you think there needs to be a skill map in a knowledge-rich curriculum school that focuses more on knowledge recall? I will come on to that, I promise, because the last one is knowledge, so I will come on to that. We use a cycle of inquiry where we use different skills such as communicate, apply, inquire, evaluate, contextualize. We have to use these in our learning questions. Do you think it's important that children have an understanding of what these skills mean when they are using the term? Yes, if it's a term that we want them to know and use, then they have to understand what those types of things mean. And so we do have to define the things that we are asking students to do. I think that answers your question. Okay, this is an example from an RE Today book called Assessment in RE. And this shows that there's different ways of understanding what skills are. I'm not the biggest fan of this, but you can see how the concepts have been mapped with the skills. The concern I have, though, again, I could be completely and utterly wrong, is the skills seem to be very much focused on knowledge and also with regards to GCSE criteria. The concepts, they're great, but the skills are not the skills we've just looked at, but they're to do with GCSE skills. Now, but your school, you might decide that that's fine. I think just as long as you can articulate what that is, then I think it's important to do so. So the skills are different. I would suggest that these types of skills are the most important, but this curriculum has decided that there are other skills that are perhaps better articulated and are more a preparation for Key Stage 4. So there's different ways of doing things. So I think that's one where perhaps knowledge and the skills of using knowledge have become more focused there. So the final aspect of what we're assessing is to do with knowledge. And I think one of the problems with regards to knowledge is that it is often seen, or it has been seen in the past, to be an either-or situation. So you've got the skills and you've got the knowledge, and almost knowledge became a dirty word when we were talking about the skills. They were almost like a byproduct that we were using to illustrate the skills. And so Richard Kuhr, he's the new HMI to do with, I don't know how to say his name, so I've just made that up, that's why I pulled a face. He is new HMI for RE, and he talks about substantive and disciplinary knowledge. And by substantive, he means stuff. So the 5 pillars of Islam are Shahada, Salah, Zakah, Sawm and Hajj. So that would be substantive. And there is a danger which he acknowledges, that it is a move towards reductive fact-based curriculum. And I think that is a danger, if I'm honest. And he recognizes it as a danger as well. That if all we're talking about is an accumulation of knowledge, then we're missing out the skills that I think are an important part of the pitching of RE and the assessment of RE. Because if all it is learning new stuff, then there are no skills to be involved. There's no attitudes, there's no concepts. There's just, you now need to know, instead of this year you can know the 6 beliefs, next year you can know the 5 pillars. And so you're developing. And it also suggests here a naive pedagogical application of direct instruction. And direct instruction has its place, and knowledge recall has its place, but not without a reliance on skills. And I think there is a development here. And so this is an example from the Norfolk Agreed Syllabus. And this is a development of knowledge, but they use, this is what we would phrase the disciplinary knowledge. And so these are the skills of the discipline that we want them to be able to develop. And so within the Norfolk Agreed Syllabus, they have theology, philosophy, and human and social sciences. But this is a recognition that when we explore RE, we explore it through a historical lens, we explore it through an anthropological lens, we apply it through a theological lens. So there's lots of different ways of interrogating RE. And I think that's what we need to be familiar with, in recognizing that there's not just one skill that we're developing. So the disciplinary knowledge is essentially the skills that we've already been talking about as well. Okay, so that's fine. And so, but what happens is there has developed an either or, and I think when we're planning RE, we can utilize both. And John Hattie suggests that we have to have learning intentions that are both knowledge-based and skill-based. And so in, again, his book, Visible Learning, he talks about. So one of the important things with regards to assessment is the way that we give feedback and the way that we help children make progress. And if it's all about knowledge, then we just need them to learn a little bit more. But if it also involves skills, then we're discussing about how we can improve and what it is that we can do better next time. And that's important because Dylan William talks about, well, if all we ever say is, well, you did this, you did this, you did this, and you didn't do this, this, and this, then that's not feed forward, that's not feedback or useful assessment language. It's about, okay, you've done this, which is fantastic. You've shown you've been able to do these things. Now, next time when you utilize new knowledge, you need to be able to utilize these skills. And so it's about looking at the skills and able to move forwards. So Hattie suggested some historical ones. So I've taken what he used as historical ones and applied them to RE ones. So to know the key events of the nativity story, to know the various features of a mosque, to know how Muslims celebrate Eid al-Adha, to know the reasons why Christians celebrate Easter. Those are all very knowledge-based. But what we can do is we can either turn them into one all by themselves, or we can add a skill. To know the key events of the nativity story and to be able to understand its importance for Christians, to know the various features of a mosque and to be able to write an explanation text, to know how Muslims celebrate Eid and to compare with my own experience, to know the reasons why Christians celebrate Easter and to be able to use sources to distinguish between fact and opinion. So we're then using the skills to add to the knowledge. And so essentially, whenever we write learning outcomes, if we write learning outcomes, we probably conflate the two and recognize that we're doing that. It's just Hattie here has separated them in that way. So we have to, when we're pitching a lesson, think, okay, what knowledge do they need to know? But also, what skills do they need to develop within this? And I think if we do that, then we have a lesson that is pitched appropriately, and therefore everything else falls into place. And so it's all about the learning journey. So Andrew Wright suggested that in his new book, Critical RE, I think it's called, I can't remember completely. And so what he suggested is we have to combine the two in the way that we give feedback. So it's not just about you've been able to do this, but that we actually highlight within a specific topic what we're having children do. So they give some generic things, and then he provides a specific example. So you've understood that the question, does God exist, is an ultimate question. You've understood that this question explores the nature of reality, and you've understood that the various ways of thinking about what's real, and then given an example. So it's about, and I'll use a further example. So if I want children to be able to develop skills with regards to Hajj, I don't just give them some kind of ephemeral, groundless skills. I give them specific examples for each of the things that I want them to be doing. So I suggest that one of the events of the Hajj means. I'll relate to how one of the events of the Hajj reflects the Muslim beliefs. I describe the features of the Hajj in detail. So these are taking the skills that have been applied and discussed earlier and actually putting them into a specific place to create success criteria. And this is where I think both Hattie and Dylan William suggest that we co-construct, so we can work out with children. So these are the things that we want you to be able to do. What do you think that will look like? So what does it mean to describe the features of the Hajj in detail? What does that mean? How would you marry this approach with a data collection system in a school that uses percentage? And that's one of my issues, is I sit in an ivory tower, and although when I worked in a school, I had a privileged position in the way that I was able to argue for what I did, and that RE didn't necessarily fit the structures that they were trying to put into place. I recognize that's probably even less possible today than 10 years ago. We work in a system that different schools are able to determine what they want. And I think that's problematic in being in having people report such blunt things every time. And so I would have an argument, but then in the end, I would have to do it. And so there are ways to do, in the old days, there used to be ways to kind of level a test, but I don't think there is an easy way to take a percentage and turn it into, or take what we're doing and turn it into a percentage. So I think I'm trying to think of a way to do it, and I'm not sure there is, unless you just kind of said, okay, this band, which is I suppose the way that we do GCSEs, isn't it? This band gets a 9, this band, and so on, and we just do that. And so we kind of create levels within our classroom. But my concern is that that system shouldn't be there. But if it is, then we do have to find a way to do it. And that's where perhaps the traditional view of assessment comes in and can be used in that way. But I don't agree with it, which seems rather strange considering some of the things that I do. But I think throughout the school, there should just be formative, and there should be against criteria that pupils are making progress rather than about percentages. So I think it's a hold your nose and kind of input things. But it may be that banding is the best way of doing things, even though I don't like doing that. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, because I don't know is the answer. Okay, so we are going to talk just for a few minutes about the how, but I think I may need to do a further session on kind of specific examples. So I love comic books. I love all things science fiction. I love all things fantasy. So two of the people that I like are Wolverine and Iron Man. And so I would suggest, for those of you that don't know either of them, so Wolverine's armor is something called adamantium. And this is welded to his bones. There was some kind of procedure, and it's a part of him, it's part of inside. Iron Man is a suit. And so I think when we do assessment, we should be doing a Wolverine style assessment as opposed to an Iron Man. And the reason I mean that is that assessment should just be part of what we do, should be interwoven into every lesson, and not just something that we stick on the end or we put on. And so that's what Iron Man does. His is a bolt-on armor. Wolverine is a part of who he is. So if we look at our curriculum, is assessment just a natural part of what we're doing, or is it a bolt-on to kind of meet needs? And I know other people are now suggesting that, yes, we've argued the case and we've been told no. And it's just, yeah. And part of the problem is the system within which we work that makes schools have these flight paths or whatever else that is there. So we always have to, and I think there's a way of doing those flight paths within the way that we teach and not necessarily in the way that we report. But you work in a system where I think you do have to kind of hold your nose and kind of go with it. And so an example of an Ofsted report, the curriculum did not stop for assessment, but was rather a vehicle for it. A formal assessment for Year 9 tested pupils' ability to apply what they'd learned about the Shoah in the context of studying Elie Wiesel's Night. The tasks both elucidated pupils' achievement while simultaneously contributing to their learning. So again, this is one of my soapboxes, and you are free to disagree. I'm not keen on tests, on pieces of work that have pupils just provide single word answers. So can you name the 5 pillars? Where was Abraham born? All of those types of things. We give them something where they can apply both the knowledge and the skills that they have developed throughout the process of learning. And we don't even have to do that within a sit-down exam. Now, I know GCSEs and A-levels are separate, but essentially we just have them apply those things. And we make it the Wolverine style where it's just a part of what we do. So Dylan William, again, he has put this on here. And he suggests that these are central, again, to what we do with regards to assessment for learning. So we clarify, share, and understanding of learning intentions. So children know where we're going. We've discussed it with them. And again, he doesn't suggest that we necessarily have to put them on the board every lesson, but that we have discussed as a group, as a class, where we're going with things. And then we engineer effective discussions, tasks, and activities that elicit evidence of learning. So that's not necessarily writing a test. That's questioning, that's giving tasks. It's interesting, I did a research project a couple of years ago with some local schools with the university. And one of the schools withdrew because what I was asking them to do and to trial was from year 7 to 9, I wanted them to assess not using exam questions from a GCSE. And the school that withdrew said that they were unable to do this because that's the only way that you could assess legitimately what was taking place or the learning that was taking place. I'm thinking, well, no, that's just nonsense. Because if, for example, you design a brochure for a mosque, you can show as much understanding about the features, the importance, how it's used, all of those things within that brochure as you can within an exam question, and possibly be far more engaged in what's going on. And so we're utilizing discussions, tasks, and activities that elicit evidence. We don't have to sit down and do an exam question at the end of every lesson. We activate students as learning resources for one another. That's really important, is children can be a source for others. Activating students as owners of their own learning. So do they know where they're going? Do they know what they're doing? And then providing feedback that moves learners forward. And again, I've heard Dylan William describe our feedback that we use, not as a rear view mirror, but as a windscreen. So essentially, yes, it's nice to know what's happened, but what can you do next? And again, a further example that I always use is my eldest daughter coming home at the end of year 9 with an art report that said she was a level 7, which is great, it's wonderful. And the target for improvement was to keep doing what you're doing. It's like, well, actually, if she keeps doing what she's doing, she will remain as a level 7. Now, I know levels have gone, But essentially, we have to be able to say, okay, well, the next stage in your learning is to be able to do X, Y, or Z. So our feedback needs to become much more recognizing both what has been done well, but also signposting where they can go next. And I think I fall into this trap in a university. We had an external examiner a couple of years ago who said, if anyone gets 70 or above, essentially the feedback is congratulatory rather than, yep, you've done that great, wonderful, and specific, but now you need to kind of point your way forwards. And I think this is something that obviously became de rigueur in about the year 2000. So assessment for learning, and there were 10 principles within this. But I'll just highlight a couple that kind of with regards to it having an emotional impact, learner motivation, that assessment is about moving pupils forward, not about stopping pupils. And I think that's really, really key. So I'm just going to use a couple of examples. And these ones come from Dylan William and Thompson in 2008. And they build on what we were talking about before. Actually, they're exactly the same things. But activating students as owners of their own learning, if we just talk a little bit about that, it's about helping students understand how they're learning as well as what they're learning at the same time. To activate students as learning resources, and that's where collaborative learning, reciprocal teaching, peer assessment come into place. Now, peer assessment only works if there are criteria against which, if you've co-constructed the success criteria with the students in the first place. If you just say, have a look at that answer, see what you think, you have to have co-constructed the success criteria so that pupils know what they're looking for. Okay, one of the key ways that we do this is within questioning. And questioning is something that is both at the same time simple, but also extremely difficult. And one of the 10 key principles that Assessment for Learning outlined was that assessment is a professional skill. Yes, we can all ask questions. We learn very early. At about the age of 2, we begin asking questions all of the time. But as we become a teacher, we recognize that we have to design the questions that we're asking prior to the lesson. And that's, I'm not going to go back, but that's where we go back to the skills and the knowledge. So those will help us formulate the questions that we want children to be able to answer. We use targeted questions as well. Now, there is a debate about this. So there are some people who would say that, well, hands up is the most key thing, so it increases learner motivation. But actually targeted questions, if we have designed the question well and allow pupils time to think, then it will get better. So we can actually allow pupils time to think, and sometimes we have to ask questions that require a thought rather than a correct answer. And building explanations, and obviously I'm sure you all do this, but you begin with one question and then you bounce it to another and then you bounce it to another and so on. But at the same time, we're also encouraging pupils to ask questions. And so sometimes this is a part of our inquiry approach within RE. And if you look in the 2013 Ofsted report, it talks a little bit about this inquiry approach as well. But if you look at the statue of Ganesh, which is on the right-hand side as you look at it, when I teach the story of Ganesh to, I've used this with year 7 really, is I ask them to come up with the questions that they have about Ganesh. And then they are to go away and answer those, because if children come up with questions for themselves, then they want the answers. They want to know why he has an elephant head. They want to know why he has one tusk. They want to know what the symbol in his forehead means. So having children come up with those questions and then be able to perhaps explore those questions, and you kind of select the ones that you want answering, means that children go away and they still fulfill the learning that you want them to do. So questioning can be used to check factual knowledge, but they should be used as a part of the assessment process at every stage of what we're doing. Now, Blaylock sent me this a number of years ago, and these are just some strategies that we can use with regards to questioning. So we've talked about planning, raising the wait time. It really is remarkable how short a time we give pupils to answer, require thought, use a high proportion of open questions. Think, pair, share is perhaps the best way to use targeted questions, because everyone in the classroom should be able to have an answer if they've discussed it with a partner. And then one of the key things is build planning and curriculum units around questions. What are the questions that we're trying to explore when we're designing our curriculum journey? Okay, I will make these slides available, so don't stress too much about anything. But if the curriculum learning journey is planned well, assessment will be seen to provide the framework for learning. And we also have to remember why and what we're assessing. So I think just because of the way that I kind of designed today, we haven't been able to talk about the specific traffic lights and all of those different kinds of things that we do. That we've talked about, well, how it's just a part of the learning journey and just an integral part of what we're doing. And Catherine suggests that we ask for think, pair, share, justify. I think that's really good, yes, because we want something more worthy than perhaps just a one-word answer. And I think it is about the deepening of learning. So I think what I've tried to do throughout today, and hopefully it's been useful, I don't know, has been just to kind of show how assessment isn't a test, but it's just planning, essentially. And if we're planning effectively, then assessment kind of takes care of itself. Just before I open up for questions, just a reminder, if you can either take a photograph of that or copy and paste it, if you could fill in an evaluation, it will then take you to a link on my website, which you'll need a password for, where you can download a certificate with that password. So are there any questions at this stage, or at the end even, because that's the end of my chattering on with myself? Any questions, queries, or comments? If not, thank you very much for your time. Katie, do you think all assessment should be shown in books? No, I don't. I think assessment is shown in your lesson plans. I think assessment is shown in verbal questioning. I think assessment is every stage of the learning that is taking place. I think, yes, there should be some things in books, but I don't think it all needs to be shown in books. And so if you're planning, monitoring the learning in lessons well enough, then I think that's good. But then invariably it will be shown in books as well. Do you think we should still use GCSE questions as well as all the other approaches, or a range of approaches? I think you should use GCSE questions for your GCSE classes. I think a knowledge of GCSE skills is incredibly important for children who are taking a GCSE. But I think if we start them in year 7, they will be burnt out by the time they get to year 10 or 11. But again, you are free to disagree with me on that one. I know lots of people do. I just think, let's make Key Stage 3 Key Stage 3. We have to log every piece of assessment on an assessment map, therefore everything has to be graded. Do you think skills can be graded? Yes, I do, purely because of my experience with levels. And so if we look at those skills ladders that RE Today publish, that the RE Review publish, there are different stages. Now, you will have to kind of turn them into numbers, which I'm not which I'm not necessarily advocating, but if you have a system where you have to show numbers, then I think those skills can be quite naturally shown, because they were shown before they were put back into end of key stage statements. How would you justify to SLT not using Key Stage 4 criteria in Key Stage 3 lessons when they expect to see it? I would suggest that they look at the stuff that's coming out of Ofsted at the moment, which is saying that we don't need that Key Stage 3 needs to be meaningful and deep all by itself. And I think the way SLT have interpreted this generally is that they mean the content. So let's just do something different. So there are some schools that I know that at Key Stage 4 do Christianity and Judaism, And at Key Stage 3, in year 7, 8, and 9, all they do is Christianity and Judaism. So I think the way the schools have interpreted that is, well, we need to just do more breadth at Key Stage 3, which is fine. But I think it also means is we need to be doing something more significant. So I think Key Stage 3 needs to stand by itself, and I think they need to look at what people are saying within Ofsted, is that we don't need a 5-year Key Stage 5. Quite naturally, the skills of evaluation, appraisal, and everything else are a part of those skills that we're looking at within Key Stage 3, but they don't need to be directly linked to exam questions and everything else. So I think I could possibly, I may try and do this, map what's taking place within my skills-based curriculum at Key Stage 3 and saying, look, these are the skills that they're going to develop, therefore, into Key Stage 4. I hope that helps, I think. Okay. If there's any further questions, I'm happy to hang about. But thank you so much for attending. Hopefully it was useful.